panel is slightly different. It's extremely personal to me. And with Sanjoy and Chinmay's permission, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to present this and contextualize this and position myself. Sanjoy, is that fine? Thank you. First of all, it's personal because it's an honor to sit on the same dais with Sanjoy Hazarika. Sanjoy Hazarika, to me and to my generation of young people growing up in Assam, is a relentless warrior. He has worked hard, honestly. His work is impeccable in its research and breadth, and it's also extremely political and personal. Sanjoy, it's an absolute honor. Thank you so much. Chinmay, I got acquainted with him on the back of a rickety bus which had a bed just 3 days ago, and I was blown away with the work that he has done. I hadn't read you before, Chinmay, and I had a PDF, and simply the breadth, the remit, the ambition, and the precision of his work is outstanding. So thank you for both being here. It's personal for another reason. The trope of conversation today, borders, migration, I'm sure as it's to many of you, in fact all of us, we negotiate borders every day. About 6 years ago, just before my father passed, and I realized that he wouldn't be along with us very long, I came down from London, where I live, to ask him certain questions about his movements. And we recorded that in one of our phone recordings. My father left Dhaka in 1942 when he was 4 years old. And he tells me that almost for the next 7 to 8 years, as he spent his time in a refugee colony in Calcutta, he would ask his mother, "Ma, Dhaka kabe jamu?" Means, when do I go back? I grew up in Assam. My father was posted there. He used to work in a medicine company. And I believed myself to be an Assamese more than anything else. Till today, I have lived in many countries. Nowhere do I feel at home as much as I do in Guwahati. But in Guwahati, growing up as a Bengali in the 80s and 90s, Sanjoy would know, we were called the Bongals, the outsider. Every day of your life, you get to know that you don't belong. And you didn't realize why you don't belong. But your school's friends, people you sit with in class, they would all tell you that, Bongal. You'd play with them, but every time there's a fight, you're the Bongal. When we came back home, my father and mother would say, but you don't belong here because you live in Calcutta, or you belong to Calcutta. The people of Assam have no culture, we have all the culture. And I believed it, that I don't belong here, though I wanted to belong. I speak Assamese even 25 years later, like a fluent Assamese person. You wouldn't know that I'm not an Assamese. I read and write too in Assamese. But this continued. And I left for Delhi for many years. Now I live in London. And I have lived in London for 15 years, and not for a day has there not been an evening when at the end of it, or sometime during the day, I haven't felt enough, let's go back. It doesn't happen though. It was my wife, who is British, who did not ever travel to India before she met me, who brought me back to Assam, and how wrong my father was about Assamese culture. She's doing her PhD on the Sothrio dance form in Majuli, in a particular Sothro. And the amazing richness of Assamese music, dance, drama was brought home to me by a person who had never been to Assam because of rigorous scholarship. I had missed all that because of my upbringing. What I'm trying to say here is that in all these negotiations that we always do, sometimes we miss the very obvious, like I did, but there is a sort of longing and belonging which we are all part of. Now, one of the things to think through today is we almost take the nation state as given. All of us, when we think of borders, we think of nation states. right? How repressive state apparatuses work on us, who belongs, who doesn't belong, how are we made to belong, all of these things. Every time there's an Indian national anthem, you'll all get up without thinking, why do we do it? Why do we owe our patriotism to a country with borders, borders which are invisible, but we are made to believe, and why not to entire humanity? But what Chinmay's book does brilliantly, and Chinmay, I'll bring you in here, is he goes back to a time before the modern nation state is born. And he tries to chart out 1,000 years of migration into India and within India. So Chinmay, starting with you, how are you brave enough to consider the remit of your work? It's just astounding.
Thanks, Somnath. This book is a culmination of about 10 years of my research on migration. A lot of my own research was in the last 200 years. And I realized that there's actually no book which tells you this story of incredible migrations in Indian human history. We either talk about the Aryan migration, thousands of years back, or we come to indentured migration in the 19th century. But India has been a country on the move. Something as obvious, for example, as virtually every adult Indian woman is a migrant. Because when you marry, you leave the village and you go to a new house. The census of India counts over 300 million women as migrants. And this is a fact throughout history. So throughout 2,000 years history, more women have moved than men. That's the first starting point. If you look at what the ancient migrations, the medieval migrations, you realize that actually a lot of people were on the move. It's a very interesting migration because in India, people don't seem to intermarry too much across castes and communities. But they preserve these identities, but they've been moving. And in my work, I've tried to bridge this gap between international migration and internal, and trying to see how these two are often very closely related. Often internal migration is the first step that leads to international, when we use it when the sort of idea of a nation state comes about. Or sometimes international migration forces us gets reoriented towards internal migration. So this book departs from conventional sort of work on migration by looking at both internal, international, by looking at both present and the past. And I look at a scale of sort of regional unit of analysis that is actually lower than either the nation state or the state. I look at districts. And districts have, amazing histories in India. You can look at cities and villages as well. But district, for me, was a very nice unit of analysis. And when you start your analysis at this level, not internal, not international, but just looking at a particular region, you realize that migrations have been going on for such long periods of time. And that modern day borders have come, and it's very difficult to make sense of the impacts of these borders on migrations without understanding the history.
But Chinmay, though migration has been going on, as you say, and almost every woman in India is a migrant, there are certain communities that you focus on who are particularly mobile. Would you want to tell us a bit about the communities that you focus on and why?
Sure. So there are two aspects. You can look at it broadly in terms of it as the migration of labor, the migration of capital, that is business communities. The business communities, I think everyone in this audience automatically connects with. You've probably always wondered about why there's so many Marwadis in Calcutta, or why there's so many Sindhis in Bombay or Delhi, or the Gujarati Banyas, or the Chettiars from the south, which have huge connections to Burma and so on. And so there's a chapter in this book called Merchants and Capital. And it's important because I work in a business school, and I often tell students it's impossible to understand the world of business in India today without understanding the migration of these communities. And so there's a chapter which takes the reader through the migration of all these communities, which have very strong identities in India even today. But the core of this book is this idea which I try and bring out called the Great Indian Migration Wave. And the Great Indian Migration Wave is a story about last 150 years of mass migration from certain parts of India. So if there's anyone in the audience from the Konkan region, you're a descendant of this wave. If you belong to the Bhojpuri-speaking world of Eastern UP, Western Bihar, you're a part of this wave. If you belong to coastal Odisha, you're a part of this wave. If you belong to southern districts of Tamil Nadu, you're part of this wave. If you belong to pretty much any part of the West Coast on one side of the Western Ghats, from Ratnagiri to Kanyakumari, you've been part of this wave. And this is a migration wave uninterrupted for more than 120 years of men leaving, working sometimes their entire lives outside, but also coming back. And so this is an idea which I try and bring in this book of certain communities, whether it's, I mean, a lot of important phenomena that we see today outside. If you look at the reason why we have so many dosas and idlis on the stalls outside, this is because of a particular community. You know, the Udupi, first the Brahmins, but then also the Bunds and a variety of communities, which moved from a district in Karnataka called Udupi. A lot of them went to Bombay and then across, you know, India. And it's just the story of a migration of one community which specialized into one occupation and really helped all of us, you know, get dosas pretty much anywhere in India. This is just one community. You can look at the Marathas and Mahars of Konkan. You can look at communities in coastal Odisha. 100 years back, they were going to Burma. They were working the fields in Burma. They were also, you know, boatmen in Burma. Today, a lot of them, they're about, you know, more than almost 500,000 people from coastal Odisha and Gujarat. And they're working in a variety of sectors again. So it's a 360-degree move from coastal Odisha. 100 years back, Burma, and today they're working in Gujarat. So this great Indian migration wave is a story of much, I say 60% of coastal India, a huge chunk of the Bhojpuri-speaking belt, which I argue is the world's largest pool of migrant labor. They send not only people on indenture to Mauritius, Fiji, but they send people to Kolkata, you know, Bombay, and a variety of other places, and they continue to do so. It also includes much of the Himalayan range. It includes eastern Punjab, not all of Punjab. Almost every Punjabi you meet outside India comes from one of these clusters around Hoshiarpur and Jalandhar. Some parts of Rajasthan. So they are literally small clusters because migration works through networks. And once these corridors are formed, they're very, very stable over time. The Northeast is a very special example of... the Northeast is a very special example of mass immigration or in migration in the last 150 years. One of the fastest growing region of India between 1900 and 1970 was the region that we would call Assam broadly. And you know, I mean, he's going to tell you a lot about the Northeast, but there's a huge history of migration of different communities before the borders were drawn. And once the borders were drawn, it's not the fact, you know, that suddenly things changed. And in the book, I bring this out, you know, by a quote of I.G. Patel, who was an RBI governor in the past. After the 1971 sort of Bangladesh war crisis, huge refugee crisis, a lot of people went back, and he was at a dinner at Harvard. And a person who used to work on migration history said, oh, you know what? So now the migrations will resume. And I.G. Patel never knew this history of migration. And he said, what are you talking about? And those are the migrations we still see today. So there's these long continuities of migrations, which even borders sometimes find it very tough to stop.
Chinmay, before I go to Sanjay, one last question. Given that you put the context of the history of migration, does it help you understand the violence that is unleashed in so many parts of India at this point of time against what we call outsiders? How and when does this notion of indigenous and outsider therefore come into play?
I think, I mean, that's a, you know, excellent question. I think I'll talk more of, you know, the central and other, let's say northeastern parts of India. One way to understand this is to try and find out which parts of India have had a lot of people coming in and have seen a lot of protests. And I belong to a city, you know, I grew up in Mumbai, which today, as if you go out in the movie halls, there's a movie on Thackeray, Bal Thackeray, ironically played by a Muslim migrant worker from UP, you know, who's representing Bal Thackeray. It's one of the most ironic sort of instances because Bal Thackeray spent a lot of his later part of his life against these particular migrants.
And apparently almost everyone on the sets is not from
Mumbai. Yeah. So, you know, so Mumbai is a very fascinating place. We love its cosmopolitanism, but at the same time, it has harbored anti-migrant sentiments for some periods of time. Now, it's interesting why in Gujarat or Punjab, you've not seen such blatant anti-migrant sentiment. In Gujarat, there are few incidents just very recently, but historically, it has not been, you know, very or sort of very virulently anti-migrant like in Mumbai or other places. And I believe one of the reasons why that happens is often that in regions which themselves have had people moving out, they seem to understand the logic of migration slightly better. And so the hypothesis would be that, you know, in Punjab and Gujarat, you're less likely to see anti-migrant sentiment because they themselves have gone around the world to some extent.
Thank you, Chinmay. Sanjay, now if I may come to you, I'll start with a larger view of your recent work. From Strangers in the Mist to Strangers No More, there is a, for me, there was a large personal and, not large, but there was a definitive shift in your personal views and politics. I found Strangers in the Mist slightly more fractured. To hear there, I wouldn't say a reconciliation, but there is a sort of acceptance is also the wrong. I'm struggling for the perfect word, but there's a definite political movement, not a shift, necessarily a movement. Would you want to tell us a bit between the two books and how you came from one to the other?
Well, I think this is a much more personal, both are very personal books, but in this there's been a certain growth in my own thinking, perception, research, travels. I think that what's clear to, certainly to me, and I think many people who are from the region we call the Northeast, is that we know how to deal with Delhi. We are not strangers to Delhi. Delhi is still strange to us. You know, Delhi doesn't know how to handle us still. Who are these people who we can't still have an agreement with? You can't push a bill through before people rise in revolt or get very upset about some issues. But, you know, I also have a longer view of things. For instance, if you take the issue of borders and migration, which you're talking about here, even these are real sharp identity markers. I mean, in Chinmay's own book, he talks about a time when there were no sharp borders, but now the borders are becoming sharper and they're becoming divisive. So communities who are located in one state, which has been designed or, you know, whose borders have been drawn by the center, find themselves in a minority in another state.
Yeah.
And negotiating those travels, those journeys, those narratives is extremely tough and at times extremely dangerous. And to me, that came out a lot in my own travels and understanding of the thing. But what I, you know, responding again to what you said and partly what Chinmay said, the word you're looking for is engagement. There is much more engagement between the region that we call the Northeast and the rest of India than there was some time ago. The people from the region are not embracing the idea of India, but they're engaging with it much more than they've done in the past. And that is partly a reason why you see some shift in the, shall we say, the landscape in terms of the political and mental landscape of the region.
You know, one of the, I mean, even as you say, the region that we call the Northeast, there's a kind of easy formulation which happens the moment you say Northeasterner. It doesn't happen when you say Central India or Eastern India, but Northeast, whether you're from Sikkim or Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram or Assam, you're immediately formulated in the rest of India's mind, especially North India. And we have, I think, I'm sure you have struggled with it too as much as I have. In your book, in the present one, Strangers No More, you break down the different 8 states and try and show the individual patterns of politics there. But do you think that even this, it's a lazy conception that the New Delhi has made of the Northeast and clubbing them together, the 8 different states, with 8 different problems, except Mizoram perhaps and Sikkim, there has been disturbances all through.
Well, you could call it lazy, but I think it's just an easier way, I mean, to deal with.
Things are
yeah,
lazy,
yeah. And for instance, you know, the situation is so complex. We were talking about it earlier. You take what is called the Naga problem or the Naga issue. Now, most people, I'm sure many people in the audience are aware that when, for instance, the government was formed in Nagaland some years ago, not the present one, the previous one, with the same chief minister, different constituents, the first agenda was a resolution of the Indo-Naga problem. Now, where that is a resolution across parties, on what, in which state will you ever have such a statement as part of a political manifesto? The second thing is that, when you're talking even today about issues relating to Nagaland and so on, people forget that pre-independence, there was an agreement with the Naga leadership, which basically said after 10 years, the Nagas will be free to choose their own path.
That was in 44.
No, in 47, but just before independence. And that was actually repudiated by the central government, by Nehru and so on. But the Nagas still hold on to that. So, the weave is very complex. You need to understand that weave in order to make sense of what's happening now.
Yeah, I'll just tell you an interesting anecdote. When Nehru came to Nagaland after independence and was giving a talk, the Naga elders walked out of the talk by slapping their bums. Nehru never came back but sent back Afsa. So that was the Naga elders' response to our first Prime Minister.
That was because the DC refused to give them an audience. They came to meet him, and they said, he said, no, he's too busy, he can't meet you. So they went, the only thing he saw were people getting up and leaving, slapping their behinds. And the Prime Minister of Burma was with him, so it was doubly embarrassing.
He was very embarrassed. As we move into nation states and borders and politics, it's important to perhaps address the main issue of the day in Assam, the NRC. So would you want to give the audience, many of whom might not be familiar with NRC and its politics, take a bit of time to lay it out?
Well, the NRC is, as we know, the National Register of Citizens. This is an exercise which was carried out in 51. And that's the first NRC, which was done in Assam. And there is an agreement called the Assam Accord, which some of you will have read about and heard about, because in the current turmoil and agitation and political discourse that's going on, time and again people refer back to this Assam Accord of 1985 and why it can't be changed. Now, the National Register of Citizens was agreed to in 1985 among all the government of India, the agitators, the student agitators who had fought on the issue of illegal migration for 6 years, and the government of Assam, saying that there will be detection and deportation of those who would come illegally post 1971. Now, it came at a great cost, that agreement, because for 6 years Assam was in turmoil. It wasn't just protests on the streets and torchlight processions. During the elections of 1983 in February, and I covered it as a reporter for the New York Times, something like, nobody actually knows the final figure, but nothing less than 3,000, a figure not less than 3,000 people were killed in a series of incidents and massacres across the state, opposing the election. So the NRC, for short, has come out of that agreement. You need to find out the number of people who are perhaps of foreign origin or who have come post-71 into the state. Now, this is, as I say, a state-specific accord. It was designed in 1985, and there are elements of it which have been implemented and there are elements of which haven't. In the past 4 years, actually the process began about 6 years ago to try and identify people and so on. But I think what has picked up pace over the last 4 years. And I think many people would have seen reports of 4 million people not making the cut. Now, that is not a final list. It doesn't indicate actually the number of people who've, quote, come illegally from Bangladesh, they think. That's the general assumption since 1971. That figure is being recalibrated because many people have filed claims. I'm not on the list, for example. I've chosen not to file a claim saying that I need to be there. But there are many who've been left out because for the very simple reason they didn't have the documentation, or the approach, I would say, was somewhat prejudiced. And I think the process was not as watertight as it should have been. So in the process, now you have something like 32 lakh people who file claims. And this will go on for another 6 to 8 months. There is no end to it, because once this is over, again people will file cases in court saying that they were left out. My position on something like the NRC, on which there is general agreement in Assam across political processes, is that even if one Indian gets left out, I call into question the validity of it. Because there is one fact which we cannot walk away from, which is that nobody can be deported to Bangladesh because there's just no agreement with Bangladesh on deportation. That's one. You can detect them, you can perhaps even delete them from the list, but you cannot deport them, and certainly you can't put them in detention camps. That is a very bad idea. So, and if you
So what
link
might
it,
be the resolution then? If what is the purpose therefore of this exercise if they're detected, but then you say your position is...
well, Bangladesh says there are no Bangladeshis
I
in
completely
India.
agree. So what...
So I think the only thing, in the Assam Accord, there was a clause which envisaged disenfranchisement of people who came illegally between 66 and 71. These are largely Hindus who had come illegally for 10 years, and then they were put back on the rolls. So you could possibly see something like that, but that is a huge task. In the meantime, these people will be voteless, if not stateless. And that's a pretty challenging task. I mean, given the sort of tension and confusion and unhappiness and suspicion that exists right now, this would be a very, very difficult thing to do. And the eyes of the world and of the rest of the country really are on us, on this little state which has so many problems. I mean, we are part of a larger region that has 220 ethnic groups. It's the most complex place certainly in South Asia. And we have migrants who've come from all over the place, from Nepal, from Myanmar, from Tibet, and from Bangladesh, apart from other parts of the country. So, I hope at some point we'll discuss also the citizenship bill, because that needs to be also taken into the conversation.
Do you want to bring in the citizenship bill now, before I go back to Chinmay?
Yeah, on the citizenship bill, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, as it's called, CAB, seeks to enable people who are of 6, shall I say, minority groups from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, to give them citizenship if they've come on long-term visas or whatever, and if they've come illegally to India. And this is a process that will be valid up to 2014. Now the process, the agitation against this, which has picked up in Assam and across the Northeast, including allies of the BJP and BJP leaders themselves in the region, in fact, several states where the BJP is in alliance, including Manipur, where the chief minister is from the BJP, Meghalaya, and Nagaland, have issued statements, cabinet positions, saying that we will not accept this. This is not acceptable to us, because this will put us in great danger, small communities. So what has really happened is that there is a real churning on this issue, saying that how could you change the goalposts after there was an agreement 33 years ago? The agreement was Assam specific. This is we are saying that this is the Assam Accord. It is unique to this place, to this time, to this region, to this narrative, this geography. It cannot be subsumed by a national act that seeks to change the thing in the process of time. So from 71, you go to 2014 without even a proper consultation. So people are very angry. And I think this is what we need to understand, what Delhi needs to understand, is that you're making the same mistake that previous governments have made, that Lieutenant's Delhi, or Lutyens Delhi, is not just one party or one group of a cabal of intellectuals belonging to a particular leftist orientation. Lutyens Delhi is whoever is in power. You're making the same mistake by not listening to the voices of people. I mean, I wrote a piece, you have to listen to people, you have to take them along, you have to dialogue with them, and you have to bring them together. Because in that region, we've seen enough bloodshed, we've seen enough violence, we've seen enough insurgencies, and you need to create goodwill. So to me, the litmus test of any act or any act of government or any act that we do, does it create goodwill or does it end by creating ill will and bad blood, you know?
Thank you, Sanjoy. Chinmay, if I may come back to you and talk, just picking up from what Sanjoy has been talking about governance and good governance and intentions. In your book, and you know, as we know, post-independence, as our first Prime Minister embarks on his period of development, the large dams, there's also the effects of it which starts in the 70s, the Chipko movement and the environmental disasters which start. Could you tell us a bit about the conflict, the violence which happened since independence and the migration patterns which followed because of the Nehruvian program of Soviet-style development?
Yeah, I mean, if you see Indian history, I mean, this story of development-induced displacement has longer roots. If you see, this famous Land Acquisition Act of India, it's 1894. That was when it happened. And in my book, I start off with the railways. How, the first railways, when they were set out, it did evoke protests, and the authorities actually did change and bend railway lines to suit multiple sort of feelings, including some beliefs which said, we will not be able to bury our people out here. And so the railways actually changed the lines and so on. This intensified in a big way, and so we have estimates now, conservative estimates, that cumulatively over 40 million people have been displaced, which is a very large number. Still not as large as what the Chinese have done, but this is a very large number. It's important to put this in perspective. If you look at the partition of India in 1947, the partition of Burma in 1937, and the exodus of refugees to India then, the partition of Pakistan in 1971, these three partitions, which I argue are very critical to understanding 20th century history, the cumulative sort of refugee crisis out here is about 25 million people.
Which, imagine the scale, 40 million, almost double.
Yeah, so this internal displacement has been much, much more. And what's interesting is often we do have laws for refugees. We've not signed United Nations protocols, but we have laws for refugees, but actually the laws on internal displacement came actually much later. So these have been, in a way, neglected people twice over. It was actually easier if you were a Tibetan refugee coming to India. You had, in a way, almost a few more rights and services than people who have been displaced by a variety of development-induced projects. So the book does mention, some aspects of this. There are some places where it has been really terrible. There have been, villages literally flushed out because the dam release sort of time was not relayed to the people, and so on. I think everyone understands that some amount of displacement is inevitable. It's about how do you really facilitate this in a sane manner. And if you see the new act, it's called the Right to, I think, Fair and Transparent Land Acquisition, does, I think, manage to overcome many of the bad aspects of previous sort of plans, but it's still just about 3 or 4 years old.
And just tell us also about the role class and caste plays in migration. I mean, I understand there are certain traditionally mobile castes, but what kind of a role does your class play?
So with caste, actually, it's very interesting. You might think that, and let me start this way. You might think that the poorest parts of India send out the most number of migrants. So you might think, Bihar, so many people coming from Bihar into our cities, it must be poverty driving migration and so on. The remarkable part about the Indian migration map is that the poorest and richest parts of India have the same rates of out-migration. So you have Bihar, which has, very, very high out-migration rates, more than 10% and so on. And Kerala at the other end, which also has a huge out-migration rate. Kerala is one of the most developed states of India. It would take about 3 decades for Kerala to reach, for Bihar to come up and reach Kerala today. right? And so people assume that, okay, when Bihar gets developed, there will be no reason for people to leave Bihar, but that's not how it works. So what's the connection between Bihar and Kerala is that they both have extremely high rural densities, not urban densities, but high rural densities. And there's only that much that agriculture can support. So there's this innate pressure for people to move. And so even as you're getting richer, actually there's, in fact, the migration studies show very clearly, longer term, more permanent migrations have a very positive relationship with class. That is, the richer you are, the more likely you are to move. And nowhere is this, Kerala, of course, people are now moving outside India. They're getting higher wages there. And that's leading to, Kerala is a very interesting place. People leaving Kerala, going to the Persian Gulf and many other countries. There's a vacuum now in Kerala for a lot of the jobs which the Keralites won't do. And so you have more than 2 million North Indians working in Kerala out there. What caste do these people belong to? Again, the relationship is very clear. In shorter term, more seasonal migrations, you have an overrepresentation of the sort of lower ranking castes, the scheduled tribes of India. In the more longer term migrations, you definitely have a high representation of the upper ranking castes. And I'm sure some of you are from Kerala who are out here. Some of you might have gone to Kerala. But I think that's, in a way, the laboratory of migration in India right now, where you see both mass emigration and mass in migration at the same time. And it's not a coincidence that this panel has been sponsored by Matrubhumi, which is, a Malayali news outfit, which means motherland, it's a very classic, it's a perfect sponsor for a session on migration identity.
Thanks, Chinmay. Sanjoy, if I may come back to you, we're talking about development and government projects. In Assam, in the Northeast, there's this contradiction between the Northeast, certain areas of it indeed, being very underdeveloped and now seeing very aggressive development. Arunachal Pradesh is a case in example. So I want you to tell us a bit about that. And the other part is that because of the turmoil in the Northeast, and we have about a 3,000 kilometer long border with Burma, China, and Bangladesh. China's growing influence in that region. How does these two things play out? Sorry, it's a big question.
So come back to the first question.
Let's talk about development and the Northeast.
Well, I think the Northeast is still picking up the piece, what we call the Northeast. Sorry, I find myself very uncomfortable with that phrase.
Yes.
What we call the the Northeast, or the 8 states of the region, they're still picking up the pieces. Can you hear me? It's going out loudly from, now you can? No, what I'm saying is that the 8 states of what we call the Northeast are growing, if you can say that, in a sort of rather hit and miss kind of manner. You have a little state like Sikkim, which is basically 8 lakh people, which is, I don't know, much probably less than the population of Jaipur. It has become what's called a fully organic state. So it's chosen its own path of development. As far as the other states are concerned, it's still, we're still recovering from 40 to 50 years of violence, insurgency, and conflict. And that is not easy to come out of. So Assam is perhaps a better place than a number of the other states because of oil, gas, and tea, which are the 3 sort of captive industries of the region. But now, increasingly, there is some improvement on these things. But, I always say that the government has been talking for the last 26 years now about something called the Look East policy, and now it's become the Act East policy. But if you want to look east, the idea is to connect the Northeast to Southeast Asia. The problem is Southeast Asia is not looking that way at all. Nazar is 2 ways, no? So you are looking that way, but they are not looking at you. So they're looking across the sea because sea routes are the most profitable. And within the region, infrastructure is still fairly broken. It's improved, but it's still broken. To get from one place to another, one state to another, still takes time. You have more flights coming in, but the roads aren't necessarily better. And there's X number of people who can go by flights, and certainly substantially more who would travel by road. So it's really a mixed bag. I mean, the idea is that the region grows, but it's still, I think, for instance, I work on health in Assam. We have what we call the boat clinics, which reach about 4.5 lakh people on the river. Assam has the worst maternal mortality ratio in India. It's improved. It's the best improvement in the last 20 years of any state. But it still is worse. It's worse than UP, it's worse than Haryana, it's worse than Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan. So there are the basic indicators we still have to improve substantially. I mean, one good thing is that I see the engagement that I talked about at the beginning is seen in the form of migration. There is out-migration for the first time in the history of the region. It's become an out-migrant producing area. So that's new and that's important, apart from the fact that there is in-migration as well.
So, and to come back to the second part of the question, which is quite different.
China.
Yeah.
Well, I once had a conversation in China with a very senior academic who advises the foreign ministry, and he says that, look, we are not interested in changing borders. We are not interested in conflict. Our main goal and endeavor over the next 20, 30, 40 years is economic growth. And if this border thing is to be settled, it will take another generation. It's not going to happen now. So Chinese influence in terms of the region, you know, Japan has come in a big way as a partner for India to develop the Northeast in terms of infrastructure and highways. So that is in a way a rather veiled message that India is sending through Japan that we are here. But the fact is, you know, international organizations like the World Bank cannot work in Arunachal Pradesh. They cannot fund dams or, you know, be facilitating infrastructure projects because it's a disputed region. If you look at a map of China, Arunachal is still part of China. It's southern Tibet. So there are still a few issues like that which need to be ironed out, many issues like that.
We're slowly running out of time, so I will, to give you a flavor of the work of both writers, I'll ask them to read short passages from their book, so you just get a feel of the prose. Chinmay, you want to go first?
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. So this is a famous song many of you might have heard, at least the first few lines. मेरे पिया गए रंगून, किया है वहाँ से टेलीफोन, तुम्हारी याद सताती है, जिया में आग लगाती है. It's from a movie Patanga in 1949. Shamshad Begum's famous song in a classic Hindi film about a wife bemoaning her migrant husband's absence in the middle of the 20th century echoes the feelings of millions of women before and since. The long wait, first for the postman to deliver letters and then for fleeting reunions, has been a perennial source of anguish for separated families. Rangoon in Burma, now Yangon in Myanmar, happened to be one of the important places in the world that saw many Indian migrants in the early 20th century. But similar voices can be unearthed across the world in songs, letters, and books across eras. In the Philippines today, one can hear of husbands bemoaning the absence of their wives who head to the US for work. What makes the Indian case unique is the sheer persistence and magnitude of this phenomenon, one that has lasted for well over a century now. It is also a phenomenon that affects regions covering at least 20% of the Indian population, currently comprising over 200 million people. I call it the Great Indian Migration Wave, and it ranks among the largest and longest migration streams for work in documented history. It led to the rise of cities like Kolkata and Mumbai in India and Yangon and Dubai abroad. It produced a number of freedom fighters and political leaders who went on to become presidents and Bharat Ratna awardees. It popularized various types of regional cultures, cinemas, and culinary delights. In short, it played a significant role in shaping the history of modern India, and surprisingly, it is a story that has never been told. There's some definition of this, but I end this by saying that a remarkable aspect of the Great Indian Migration Wave is the near constancy of the source areas, but literally a sea change in the destinations from the Bay of Bengal towards the Arabian Sea. How and why did these migrations occur, and why have they been so persistent? This question is best addressed by exploring the unique histories of districts, recruitment practices, railways, postal services, and maybe even dosas.
Thanks very much, Chinmay. That's fantastic. Sanjay,
This is from a chapter called Fear in a Handful of Dust, and it relates to the Nellie Massacre and my uh, visit there again for the research. A couple of 100 meters away, a handful of graves of victims of the Nellie frenzy lay silently, located behind a wall. At one edge of the graveyard, men and women worked briskly, drying the paddy that they had salvaged from nearby fields. It was just as if it was another day of saving their crops, as if nothing had ever happened here. A small black marble slab on the graveyard's wall remembers the murders, silently. In faded Assamese script, it speaks of the pure side of the Shahid, giving the day and date, year of the event, and the foundation stone laid by two ministers of the Congress party. That's 28 years after the disaster. There's no mention of how many people were slaughtered or why the stone is there, apart from the bloody date. No explanation of why these are Shahids, the same word used to describe those who died in the anti-immigration agitation, who have been honored, their families compensated, and legal cases instituted against those responsible for their deaths. In the killing fields of Nellie, silence speaks louder than anything else. Villagers rush to save their harvest, damaged by the unrelenting engineers of the Kopili Dam, an unseen monstrous fate that decides their lives and livelihoods. In Bhagdava, many still live with their memories, unwilling to rouse the angers and fears of the past. The past is closed, one wizened man says. Another doesn't agree. He lost his wife, his children, and a brother in the killings. Of course, I remember them every day. Who would not? Their images haunt me. And they still haven't received compensation, leave alone justice. Memories don't die. They fade away as a younger generation, overcoming the fears of the past, seeking to leave behind the sting of mistrust, ventures to the other side of the country, to Thrissur in Kerala to find work and peace. It's not easy, reflected Farooq as he talked on the narrow, broken mud road leading to Nellie. The railway collectors want to see our documents all the time. They're from India. They're hefty fellows, not like us. You feel scared of them. But he wanted to leave, perhaps with his family. He would go back to Thrissur. He had to repay some debts here. After that, he would migrate. There's nothing left for us anymore.
Wow. So we'll have to go to the audience soon, but Sanjoy and Chinmay both, I'll ask for closing statements. Sanjoy, what is the way forward? How do you feel? Hopeful? You are a person who has constantly mediated. You are in conversation with New Delhi, with the powers that be. You go back to Assam. How do you see our immediate and longer-term future?
I think we have to look at it just in the light of rights. The rights of people, of human beings, cannot be extinguished just like that, arbitrarily, with impunity. I have fought for a long time against the Armed Forces Special Powers Act because I think that is by itself an act of impunity, just that act by being there. But to move forward, you need to include people. You need to feel that they're concerned, them to feel that their concerns are being taken care of. You have to abide by the Constitution. I mean, anybody who has read the preamble to the Constitution, it's about equality, liberty, and fraternity. All three together. And Ambedkar, when he put it together, he said, this is a way of life. You can't have one without the other. And to me, the fact that whatever we do, there must be an assertion of rights, human rights, otherwise it's about nothing, if it's not about rights. Because if we believe in constitutional values, we must assert that governments and the opposition and all groups abide by Article certainly 14 and 21. No one should be deprived of his life or liberty except by due process. We have to choose constitutional patriotism, nothing else.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Chinmay, so that was quite moving. Chinmay, coming to you, all across the globe, right-wing governments flourish. Nationalism, which we thought was over in the 80s and 90s when globalization started, seems to have taken a backstop. In this scenario, given the present governments across Trump, Italy, Hungary, we can go on and on, Brazil, where do you see global migration in the next 20, 30 years? A slightly longer term prediction.
I think this question, one way to look at this question is that this is not the first time this has happened. In the 1920s and 30s, you had a massive backlash against migration, globalization. Walls were erected. In the US in 1965, it finally fell down. So this wall also may be built, but I believe at some point it will also fall down.
I hope not with another world war, as it happened.
Yeah. So in a way, it is an ideological cycle, which is at this particular moment, very heightened. But I think as anyone who works on migration will tell you, to have a basic sense, like he says, to respect rights, to understand the benefits of migration, the tremendous diversity that we see. The French football team which won the World Cup was almost completely immigrant or first or second generation immigrant. India benefits tremendously from people moving within India, from Indians who moved outside India and send back money, send back skills, and from immigrants as well. In the Konkan region, since people have become rich now after moving to Bombay, people from Nepal pretty much run the mango orchards in Konkan. So India has historically been a region which has had a lot of in-migration and out-migration. It has led to what the diversity that we all love and cherish in this country. And so I think we should really dig in deep. And in India, we have two wonderful sayings from the past. One is Atithi Devo Bhava, and the other is, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which one is you treat the guest as God, and the other is the world is one family.
Thank you very much. I'll open the floor for questions now. The gentleman here at the front.
Hi, good evening. Wonderful, insightful work, and I'm really educated about the...
Speak a bit louder, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Sandeep, and great work, very insightful history of Northeast. I learned a lot about it today. I also lived in London for about 7-8 years.
You have to be very brief with questions.
Very brief. And I wanted to study as an outsider the culture of natives there, primarily English people. And during my time, I also came to realize that Indians who moved there before, 2-3 generations before me, had a different kind of perspective about India and their identity after being migrated to England. So I captured all that in a graphic novel called Mind the Gap. And my question here is that, in your views, and any of you can answer it, is that when a migrant moves to a new host culture, how rigid he should be to preserve his home culture, or should he assimilate and create a new identity and a new culture?
Got it, thank you. Chinmay, I'll ask you to answer that.
Yeah, Nehru said, when in Rome, do like the Romans do. He had a very clear idea that when you go up, you should completely assimilate. Today, even the Indian government will say, no, hang on, send us the money back. So there's a clear shift in even how we engage with our people outside. Some amount of assimilation is obviously important. When you go to a place, you should attempt to, at least respect, if not learn some aspects about the local culture. A lot of it is based on who you socialize with. I think it is important to socialize outside your immediate sort of social groups. But in the book, I sort of have a play on this as to when Indians are truly assimilated abroad. And I call it a matter of water and steam. Two of the important cultural traits of India is that when we go abroad, when we pack a suitcase, we pack a mug, right? And we pack a pressure cooker, right? And so Indians are really assimilated abroad when we stop using the mug and the pressure cooker.
The lady there.
Hi, I'll be really brief. So I just want to know, climate refugees is a really new topic, but I was wondering historically in India, how the concept of climate refugees has really changed, because it's not that it's a new concept, it's just that maybe it's evolved in the way it happens. And the other side of it is also historically, can you say something about the East African migration to Western India? I'm thinking of like the Siddhi community and along the lines of that.
Yeah, so on climate refugee, so refugees, I mean, it invokes something of the state, right? So there's a border crossing and so on. But if you see climate migrants, I mean, India as a monsoon-based economy has always had this issue. If you look at coastal Orissa, this place which I keep mentioning, it's a cyclone-hit place. Migration, for all its uncertainties, is a very stable strategy. The reason they've been sending out people for hundreds of years is because every 10 years there's a super cyclone. So migration is one way out of that. What you make a good point is that this has tremendous significance in the northeast, because we know that Bangladesh is a low-lying region, and so there's going to be only more reasons for migrations in the coming years, and one has to be sort of, awake to that possibility. The book actually does mention a lot of climate migrations in the past.
Can I just add one point to it? Because, the issue about Bangladesh being a low-lying, I take that, and sea level rise is going to affect it. But India has a much larger coastline than Bangladesh, okay? Many millions, tens of millions of people, including places like Bombay, Chennai, are going to get affected far worse than any other part. And there'll be, how are you going to deal with this issue? I don't think anybody has even thought about this. How do you deal with a potentially 150 million Indians who will move from the border, from the coastal areas, or even more?
My question is for Chinmay. You spoke about migration into and out of Kerala. In a different panel 3 days back, one of the speakers said that the migration out of Kerala from the late 19th century, I mean, initially to Sri Lanka, then later Singapore, Malaysia, Malaya, and Burma, was mainly because of poverty. But I feel I just want your views. I feel the reasons for this was mainly threefold. One is the breakup of the matrilineal system. Secondly, the fact that the industries did not develop in Kerala because of its peculiar politics. And thirdly, the large number of educated, they're not necessarily poor, but they did not have avenues for employment there, so they had to go elsewhere. They were not willing to do the jobs which people from Assam, Bihar, and Odisha were willing to do.
So we have to be brief, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I gathered the question properly, but my understanding of Kerala is that it's got a unique geography, extremely high density, and that really explains much of the cross-sectional variation in migration in India can be explained by rural density. Now, what explains the variation in rural density is, again, history and, access to water and so forth. But Kerala is unique because average village in Kerala is about 20,000 people. So it has a very unique geography as well, which helps explain some of its migration patterns.
Thank you. Final question, please.
Yeah, Sanjay da, there are many questions, but I'll restrict to the one where you have left it. I've read both of your books and you have shown a lot of positivity in the recent book, No More Strangers. But where you have left is AFSPA. You say you are against, even I am completely dead against it. Tripura is the first state which has taken it over. And why can't other states, it is the state again, which is controlling the ASPA, requisitioning the center. Why can't other states also requisition and take it over? Why to keep blaming the ASPA or other things? Thanks.
On the AFSPA, it's very simple. As you know, for very long, the center was declaring a state disturbed and prolonging the act. But last year, the center basically decided we've been hit with enough crap on this, so the state takes it back. So for those who are not familiar with this, this is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which enables the army, an army officer at the rank of a Havildar, to non-commissioned officer to shoot and cause death, and he will not be, he or she will not be prosecuted. Can detain anybody without a warrant and enter any place and which is suspected of being a dump, an arms dump. So the center has said to the states, it's your baby now, you handle it. So 2 states have basically removed it, And I think that Assam wants it, but for a completely different, wrong purpose, I think, which is they are concerned about the impact, adverse impact of the citizenship bill in the armed NRC process. So I don't think you can really use a military process to deal with a constitutional and a political issue. I think it's completely wrong to involve the army in this.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time. Good evening, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much. We wish to thank our panelists Chinmay Tumbe, Sanjoy Hazarika and Somnath Batabyal. We also wish to thank our sponsors Mathrubhumi. Chinmay, Sanjay and Somnath Batabyal will be signing their books in the book signing area left to Darbar Hall. Thank you so much. See you all next year in 2020 at the same place, Diggy Palace, Jaipur Literature Festival.